The Battle of Red Cliffs is often remembered as one of the most dramatic turning points in Chinese history. It is frequently described as the moment when a smaller alliance defeated a far larger force, and in doing so, reshaped the political future of an entire era. But Red Cliffs was not a miracle. It was not the result of a single clever idea, nor a sudden stroke of genius. It was the outcome of pressure, timing, geography, and a long chain of decisions made under extreme uncertainty. Before we can understand the battle itself, we need to understand the world that existed before it. By the year 208, Cao Cao had become the most powerful figure in China. Through years of warfare, political maneuvering, and carefully chosen alliances, he controlled most of northern China and held the imperial court firmly under his influence. In practical terms, this meant enormous manpower, stable agricultural regions, and a highly organized command structure. From Cao Cao's perspective, the south was the final obstacle. Once the southern territories were secured, unification would be complete. The campaign southward was not viewed as a gamble. It was seen as a logical and almost inevitable step. The reality in the south, however, was far more complicated. At the same time, Liu Bei was in retreat. He had lost territory, lost momentum, and lost any sense of long-term security. His followers were not only soldiers, but families and refugees, all moving together in search of survival. He was not planning decisive victories. He was trying to stay alive. On his own, Liu Bei had no realistic way to resist Cao Cao. Further south, Dongwu, ruled by Sun Quan, controlled the Yangtze River region. Wu was smaller than Cao Cao's northern power, but it possessed a critical advantage. Its commanders were deeply experienced in river warfare and naval logistics. Even so, the decision to resist was deeply controversial inside Wu. Many officials believed surrendering to Cao Cao would preserve their status and spare the region from destruction. Others warned that surrender would mean permanent loss of independence and eventual political marginalization. For a brief moment, the future of China rested not on a battlefield. It rested on debate. Sun Quan's final decision to resist was not emotional, and it was not heroic. It was calculated. Surrender offered short-term safety. Resistance offered risk, but preserved autonomy. That decision led to a temporary and uneasy alliance between Dongwu and Liu Bei. This alliance was not built on trust or shared ideals. It was built on necessity. Each side understood that survival depended on cooperation. As Cao Cao's massive army moved south, a critical weakness began to surface. Most of his soldiers came from northern regions. They were accustomed to land-based warfare, not large-scale river combat. The southern climate was unfamiliar. Disease spread quickly through the camps, weakening morale and strength before any major engagement occurred. In an attempt to stabilize his fleet and reduce seasickness, Cao Cao ordered his ships to be chained together. This decision improved short-term stability, but it eliminated maneuverability. What helped his soldiers endure the river also made his navy extremely vulnerable. In contrast, Wu's forces were operating in familiar conditions. They understood the currents, the wind patterns, and how fire behaved on water. They did not rely on overwhelming numbers. They relied on preparation and environment. The fire attack at Red Cliffs was not a sudden act of genius. It was the result of careful planning and precise timing. When the conditions aligned, fire spread rapidly across Cao Cao's fleet. Numerical superiority turned into chaos. What followed was not total annihilation. It was systemic collapse. Ships burned. Disease intensified. Supply lines failed. At that point, Cao Cao no longer had a functioning army. He had no viable option but to retreat north. The southern campaign ended not because his forces were destroyed. It ended because they could no longer operate. This retreat marked a profound psychological shift. For the first time in years, Cao Cao's expansion met a clear and irreversible limit. The consequences of Red Cliffs extended far beyond the battlefield. For Liu Bei, the battle created opportunity. It allowed him to move westward, secure territory, and eventually establish Shuhan. Without Red Cliffs, his political story would likely have ended quietly. For Dongwu, the victory secured independence. Wu was no longer merely defending itself. It became a recognized power capable of shaping events rather than reacting to them. For Cao Cao, Red Cliffs was a turning point. He remained powerful, but the vision of total unification under his command began to fade. From this point forward, China would not be ruled by a single dominant force. Instead, a balance emerged. Cao Wei, Shu Han, and Dongwu formed a political triangle that defined the Three Kingdoms era. Each state possessed strengths. Each state had limits. None could easily destroy the others. The Battle of Red Cliffs is often remembered as a triumph of intelligence over strength. History suggests something more grounded. It was a victory of preparation over momentum, a victory of environment over numbers, and a victory of judgment over ambition. That is why Red Cliffs still matters today, not because it was spectacular, but because it shows how history is shaped by limits as much as by power.